Professor Billari, when you were working with your colleagues, Hans-Peter Kohler and Mikko Myrskyla, working on this paper about development and fertility, what kind of issues were prompting the three of you to get together and begin working on this? Why did you choose this research question?
So I had several conversations with colleagues before. One conversation was very important with my colleague Chris Wilson. I was a long time before at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. We were reflecting on low fertility. And then we were thinking, okay, what if the standard ideas on the relationship between fertility and development would be shown to be wrong in the longer term, would be shown to be reversed? I started doing some simple calculations and then things were left there. Then in 2008, I was planning a sabbatical stay at the University of Pennsylvania, and I started discussing with my co-author Hans-Peter Kohler about this idea. Mm-hmm. So we were starting from the idea of lowest low fertility, which was our previous hit, let's say that, and then we started discussing about the relationship with fertility and development, and I said, okay, look, Hans-Peter, let's look at some basic data. Maybe there's evidence for a reversal. We had a paper, it's a population studies paper of 2003, where we show that the number of relationships between fertility and fertility-related variables have changed during the emergence of low fertility. Uh-huh. And so this was a line we had already pursued before, and say, okay, let's look at this. And maybe we have to look thoroughly, so we have to engage a clever and promising colleague. At that time, Mikko Myrskyla was possibly, I would say, the most promising, one of the top PhD students in Penn doctoral program in demography. So during my sabbatical year, we tried to finalize this idea. Mm-hmm. And the idea was to, I can say that, basically it was to change the view we have on demographic transition. The mm-hmm. view we have on demographic transition doesn't really have an ending for the fertility decline story, except for those who think that...
it just becomes low and stays there.
Yeah, either it becomes low and stays there, or it goes to 0, or it magically gets to 2.1, but then there was no story. So let's pitch this as a fundamental change in the relationship between development and fertility.
And so you just came up with this idea that maybe there is an inflection point where it reverses. Was there any precedent for this? Did this idea come from anywhere? Or you just made it up out of thin air? Or
no, we had, let's say, for instance, with Hans-Peter Kohler, we had... and it's not only us. I mean, there were like Brewster and Rindfuss, the changing relationship between fertility and female labor force participation.
Right.
Or other scholars having this idea of shift in relationships.
Mm-hmm.
The inflection point was something where we wanted to have a more thorough empirical analysis of that. This came in the kind of elaboration of mm-hmm. the final article, and also in the final article we try to say we are not really religious about the change, the inflection point, but there could be one, and there are reasons to say that in the pathway of a country there could be a situation, a point in which this kind of relationship is changing. This came about in the gestation of the paper, and we decided to write the paper directly for a general science journal. Mm-hmm. So our targets were Science, Nature, mm-hmm. Differently from other demographic journals we were more used to, and the idea was to make that big hit because we thought this is a fundamental change to the way we see a relationship that is crucial in the social science.
When you looked for a measure of development, you decided to use the Human Development Index rather than some other more one-dimensional things like GNP or something like that. there's many different versions of the Human Development Index, some with a lot more indicators than others, right? This is a fairly basic one. How did you make that decision?
I would say three aspects. First of all, Bongartz and Susan Wachter had a paper, I think, published on Population and Development Review 96, which was about social interactions and fertility decline. And they had a wonderful graph showing a declining relationship between Human Development Index and fertility. Mm-hmm. So there was a precedent, let's say, in the demographic literature of two big scholars in the field, where the crucial aspect of the demographic transition was represented using the HDAI. Mm-hmm. So this was reason number one. The second reason was to speak to a general audience. We wanted to use something that was also used in UN, in the UN way to speak about policies and development, and this was the right dimension. The third is we experimented also with unidimensional relationships. One of the dimensions of the Human Development Index is clearly a demographic one, because life expectancy is one of the dimensions that per se alone is too demographic to be crucial in that fundamental change. Then there is education, which is a composite index already, and then there is income or income-related measures. We decided to go to the HDI as an established index, made some experiments with robustness checks, but we say something that we kept as a general line. This is not the last paper in the topic, this is the paper opening a topic. This is the first paper in the topic. We are not going to answer all questions in this paper.
Okay. What have you heard about this this paper since it was written? What kind of reactions did you get to it?
Immediately after the paper was published, Nature got 3 or 4 submissions of replications, falsifications, and we were called upon commenting them.
Right.
I think Nature decided not to publish any of the kind of falsification papers. Although, again, in the spirit of the idea, this is an opening paper rather than a paper closing a debate. It's fine to have even a paper that falsifies or partially falsifies what the paper says. I had one of the compliments was a colleague told me, okay, this was an obvious relationship. We all knew that, but no one had really published that.
That's exactly what happens with a lot of these papers that I'm doing these interviews for, is after it's written, people say, well, of course. But nobody was saying that before it was written, right?
Yeah, another colleague told me, oh yeah, I had exactly the same analysis, so you just went faster than me, but I never thought about going to Nature with this ideas again, and then say, okay, this was also the framing of the paper was important. Then since then, I think the paper has been successful as an opening paper, because there's been really a paper trying to basically deny the finding of the paper. So on demography, demography published a paper saying, okay, there is no reversal. There's been a bunch of other papers saying, yes, there is a reversal if you look at regional European data. There is a reversal in Hong Kong. There is a reversal if you only look at GDP measures, so the unidimensional version of that. I think now it's a sort of accepted wisdom. So if you go to Wikipedia now or to similar web pages, the paper is referenced in the demographic transition voice of.
And students have to read it now. Lots of students have to read it.
Students have to read it. Somehow it's a relatively easy paper. Of course, one critique we had, if I have more time, one critique we had, you're basing all your conclusion on this pure cross-sectional analysis. It's true that the main graph reported on Nature.
They didn't read the next page.
They didn't read the next page or the supplementary material,
Yeah.
the appendix, which was only online.
That's another question I have for you. If you follow specific countries over time, like you do in the second one, some of the countries are exceptions. How did you think about those countries and explain those exceptions then? And do you still think the same way about those exceptions today?
I'm sorry, I'll get something to clear my voice. Right.
No.
No. So the exceptions were mostly East Asian countries, and I think this is confirmed later on. We had an idea then that this had to do mostly with the gender relationship in these countries. We didn't really have a clear test, but again, keeping the spirit of a short, nature-like paper, opening a field, we didn't pursue testing that. In a later paper, we did a more formal test. The paper didn't have great fortune, so it's still a working paper, but basically confirming the idea that the reversal of the relationship between development and fertility can only happen when there is a certain degree of gender equality. Then a whole bunch of papers on the relationship between gender evolution and fertility came out, including a paper I contributed to. And now I think the idea that some degree or a good degree of gender equality is a prerequisite in this reversal is even stronger than before.
So this is almost like a part of the second demographic transition, the way that Bernhard and Leppegaard and Fran Coburn talked about.
Yes, so we are now at the European Population Conference in Brussels, 2018. At the European Population Conference in Warsaw, which was 2000. That's
I don't
tough.
remember.
2005, maybe 2006. I organized a debate on the second demographic transition, where some spoke for and some spoke against the second demographic transition idea. And then Eva Bernhard had this clear idea: gender is missing from the second demographic transition story, which has, I think, in general been rejected by Ron Lestager, but I think it's a fair depiction of the framework as it was depicted. So later on, this idea has been elaborated in a more in a bigger and a more systematic way by Eva Goldscheider, through the Lappegaard and others. It fits well with Peter MacDonald, Jost Esping Andersen, and also myself contributing to that. It fits. So again, gender as a prerequisite for this reversal. I think I'm still there.
And that's still the way you think about it today. So there's been some stability to this emerging picture.
There's been some stability. I think the reversal of the relationship now is, at least in advanced society, taken, I'm not saying for granted, but as something that is a safe cross-sectional relationship. Whether it's causal or not, that's where the debate is maybe happening. But again, even in terms of correlation, this is a fundamental change in compared to what we knew before.
Well, thank you for documenting it, and thank you for talking to us about it.
Thank you, Professor Carlson. It was an honor to talk to you.